Let's talk about patterns of inheritance. So how does heredity works? How are traits inherited from parents to children to grandparents, so on and so forth. The person who really figured out how inheritance works and what are the rules that govern how we inherit traits was Gregor Mendel. He is rightly named father of genetics. He was a monk living in a monastery, but it was normal for his time when he lived for people who were religious and in monasteries to do multiple different things. They could be scientists, mathematicians, so on and so forth. And Gregor Mendel was very strong in mathematics. So he had very strong mathematical skills and he liked to dabble in science. So Mendel described the laws of governing inheritance in 1866. And at that time, nobody really knew anything about genes or DNA. We didn't understand anything about cell and division. We didn't know what chromosomes were. So really, he operated in a darkness, if so to speak, and we really didn't know anything about these factors. And the only really tool that he had in order to figure out the laws of inheritance was, as I mentioned, his mathematical and statistical skills. But his findings, he published his findings, but they weren't really appreciated until 1900s when his work was rediscovered. Now, during his time in the middle of 1900s, the thinking about inheritance, the most popular thinking about inheritance was the concept of blending. So the thinking was that the factors that determines the characteristics of, let's say, a pair of individuals, a mother and a father, when they mate and have a child, their characteristics would blend within the child and give you something new. So that was their way of explaining why is it that children don't look exactly like their parents. But Mendel's findings disputed this and showed actually that no, factors that determine our inheritance are actually factors that are separate entities, and we know that those factors are genes that are sitting on our chromosomes. Okay, so Mendel tried a number of different model systems, and until he settled on garden peas. So he, in addition to being a mathematician and a monk, he also developed his gardening skills in order to do his science. So why is it that garden peas were such a good model for studying inheritance? First of all, the garden pea has a short life cycle, meaning that from the time you mate to pea plants and then they produce their children, which are what we call as seeds, and then you plant them and you get the next generation of parents. That's a short life cycle. And you can imagine if you're going to study inheritance, you want to work with an organism that has a short life cycle. Otherwise, you spend your entire life trying to gather data and you may not live long enough to make sense of the data. Garden peas are self-pollinating plants. So that means even if you have one plant, the flower has both the female and male parts of a plant and you can self-fertilize. And that was a very important feature for producing what we call, and you'll later see, pure breeding plants. And you'll see what that means. But even though they're self-pollinating, it's easy to set up experiments such that you can control the pollination, such that you can control which plant pollinates which other plant. And also he had ways of stopping a series of plants to self-pollinate themselves. At every time when a couple of plants are mated, from each mating, one can get a large number of offspring from just one mating. And if you've ever seen a pea pod, if you open a pea pod, you see there are multiple peas in one pod, and that's what we mean, getting so many offspring from one cross. And because Mendel, really, the only thing he relied on in order to make his conclusions was mathematics. And for mathematical and statistical analysis, what you need is large number of data sets in a short amount of time. So having a short life cycle and producing large number of offspring aids in doing those mathematical analysis. He was also able to find characteristics in garden peas that were easily distinguishable. You can imagine if you were going to follow the inheritance of two different characteristics, if those characteristics are too similar to one another, it'll be difficult to know what is what, and I'll show you what I mean. So here, what he did was he focused on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 characters. So these characters were seed shape, seed color, flower color, pod shape, this is a seed pod color, flower position, and stem height. So these are characters that he followed, and for each character he followed the inheritance of two different traits for each character. For seed shape, he followed the inheritance of either round or wrinkled. For seed color, it was yellow or green. For flower color, it was purple or white. For pod shape, was inflated or constricted. Pod color was yellow or green. Flower position was either axial or terminal. For stem height, it was either dwarf or tall. So you can see these characteristics are really easily distinguishable. There is no way that you can confuse one for the other. And that's one of the characteristics that made this plant so valuable for doing the analysis. Okay, so just for a fun exercise, now that you're at home, turn to the person next to you or the person in your family, and then figure out what their let's take a look at two characteristics, eye color and tongue rolling, and see if anybody in your family, what eye colors they have, and whether or not they can roll their tongue, just for fun. So next we're going to talk about Mendel's groundbreaking experiments with garden peas.